How do I start a YouTube video again? I struggled a lot when figuring out how to write this intro, and it's not just because this is my first video essay. Today's topic is quite the daunting task, and I'll be spending a lot of time systematically breaking down arguments that have persisted for quite a long while in both the casual and competitive space of this game. I know going into this video that the stance I hold is not a popular opinion among players of both the old and modern game alike. And I know that other content creators are going to see this video and give their 2 cents, which I welcome, frankly. It's free exposure for my channel, and it gets people thinking critically again about this discussion. And before anyone asks in the comments, no, this isn't some sort of joke and I'm not trying to be a needless contrarian. It's a legitimate view that I hold given the state of Yu-Gi-Oh's meta in 2023, and I think the arguments I have prepared are pretty solid. One thing I will admit to though is that I've only been playing this game since 2021. And while I've grown a lot as both a player and a deck builder in that time, I recognize that I probably haven't considered every single angle of this discussion. All I ask is that you keep an open mind, and I would love to hear feedback from everyone else in the community. So with all of that out of the way, here is why Pot of Greed should be moved to 1. Before we get into the arguments for and against Pot of Greed coming back to 1, it's important to give the proper historical context. Those who have been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! For many more years than I know already that the game today looks vastly different than it was even 5 years ago, let alone back when Pot of Greed was banned in 2005. No! Before the GX era, there were next to no archetypes. Most competitive players were playing some form of a pile deck that ran many of the same powerful staples, and regardless of if your deck was competitive or not, a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2005 actually made it past turn 4 if you weren't playing an FTK deck. The point I'm trying to get to is that you had a lot of opportunities to use the cards in your deck during a game of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And you were never really in a position in 2005 where you couldn't just play the game. You might have been at a disadvantage due to something like Delinquent Duo, but there was always an incentive back then to stick it out because you had quite a few opportunities to potentially top deck something useful and regain whatever advantage you had lost. Your next draw phase could have given you a massive blowout card like Lightning Vortex or Heavy Storm, a free graveyard summon like Premature Burial or Call of the Haunted, a strong stall card like Swords of Revealing Light, a powerful boss monster like BLS Envoy of the Beginning, or a powerful draw card like Graceful Charity, or the subject of today's video, Pot of Greed. Simply put, a free +1 like Pot of Greed was way too good to turn up for any deck at the time, and everyone ran it in their deck if they could get their hands on a copy. Plus, with cards like Dark Magician of Chaos and Magician of Faith, you could resolve Pot of Greed multiple times during a game by retrieving it from the graveyard. The closest example I can give for a deck like this in the modern game is something like Sky Strikers. For the uninitiated, a Sky Strikers player wants to be able to resolve their 1 copy of Engage as many... Wait, what? They put Engage to 2 in unlimited multi-roll? And what do you mean Colossus is still big? Ideally, a Sky Strikers player wants to be able to resolve Engage as many times during a game as they reasonably can. The reason for this is because it isn't once per turn, it thins the deck, and it grabs in archetype resources from their deck that they'll need later on for multi-roll. Pot of Greed was similar to that. But the difference is that back in 2005, every deck was running Pot of Greed. Because keep in mind, old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Is stupidly slow compared to today. Repeatedly activating Pot of Greed during a single game in 2005 was like pulling off a special summon combo uninterrupted by hand traps or other disruption. It just generates a massive amount of profit for the player that manages to pull it off, regardless of whether or not what they drew was enough for them to secure the game. And while even more busted draw cards existed back then, like Graceful Charity, you would have to keep in mind there wasn't a lot of monsters in the game back then with graveyard effects. So Pot of Greed was just better all around since there was no real cost. Knowing the context now, it probably isn't very surprising that Pot of Greed eventually got itself banned. It was just such an oppressive card back then, given that it allowed one player to generate a ton of advantage out of nowhere for free. And the only way the other player could stop it back then was if they either activated a Solemn Judgment and burned away half their life points, which, mind you, is a ridiculously heavy cost in GOAT, or if they had Imperial Order face up on board. So in other words, if you played Pot of Greed turn 1, there was nothing your opponent could do. And it was even more annoying if they also managed to resolve a card like Delinquent Duo. So with all that said, how can a card this infamous come off the forbidden list? It seems like a clear-cut case. Well, once again, we need to understand the proper context, this time relating to the modern game. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is complicated.
This card is very, very good.
Oh my god! We did it! Scream! Saliak!
The main deck is being decreased to 15 cards. Now, I know what you're thinking, 15 cards? My goodness, that's far too few.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Oh, we are so very back. 1,000 years of Tier Lament.
At its core, Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2023 is a very unique experience compared to other card games. It has a lot of problems that make getting into the game difficult for new players, but I wouldn't call the format bad. I quite enjoy it actually. Both players are often interacting on each other's turns using hand traps like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence, and the end boards can be often downright delinquent, compared to something like GOAT. Many fans of the modern game often find this style of play to be pretty fast-paced and exhilarating. Often described as the fighting game of TCGs, Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2023 is an incredibly swingy experience that often lasts 2 to 4 turns on average. However, there are a lot of different elements in the modern game that are annoying for some and deal breakers for others, and it's easily one of the biggest turnoffs keeping people from playing Modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, aside from card prices. I don't hate all the staple cards in this format. Forbidden Droplet and Pot of Prosperity are remarkably well designed despite how strong they are, but by comparison, cards like Gozen Match could be banned or limited and no one would complain because the strategies that they promote just aren't very interesting and they hinder skill expression. This is a subject that YugiTuber MBT discussed in his video on the current state of the game, and I would recommend checking it out. As it pertains to this video though, what you'll want to remember about Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there's a lot of different factors that go into designing your main deck, beyond just slapping the top 10 best cards into every deck and crossing your fingers. There's a plethora of viable archetypes in this game that all have their own unique support. When you're building a deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you're 95% of the time going to build it around one or more archetypes. On top of that, at least about half of the cards in that deck are going to be cards from those given archetypes, if not more. Many archetypes have certain synergy with other archetypes or generic staples, and there's many different diverse strategies that each have reasons for running certain generic staples over others. El Shaddoll Hollow, to give an example, would be awful in Runic, since it doesn't push its strategy all that much, but it can be a really good piece of support in a deck like Tier Laments, which wants to mill its own cards. All in all, the modern game is an unsolved format that constantly changes after each new set release, tournament result, and ban list update. But even on a casual level, the card pull size in 2023 completely dwarfs what was available in 2005. That being said, most competitive players tend to just gravitate towards dominant decks in the format in order to reduce that level of uncertainty, since playing in person is such a financial commitment. The price of the secondary market is a whole other discussion, but what's important to remember is that present-day Yu-Gi-Oh! Is expensive to play at a tournament level, and it always has been. While there isn't anything stopping someone from playing, say, Gravekeeper Numeron Dragon OTK, there's also a lot of inherent risk in piloting those decks if you're looking to win an event, since it needs to have at least a decent matchup spread. If your deck loses to Macrocosmos and everyone in the room is playing, oh god, oh fuck, granted, that's the experience running as intended. There's always going to be a top deck that the format conforms to, and whether you're piloting a meta deck or not at an event, the decision-making and judgment calls you'll have to take when designing a deck list can be incredibly exciting in its own right. It's the reason why I build my decks from scratch as opposed to net decking, even when playing casually. I just love the experimentation. There's so much legal cards in this game that it allows for countless different deck permutations, and finding two different archetypes that you think wouldn't synergize together, and getting them to not only work seamlessly, but produce incredible results, can feel like you're jacking into the Matrix. However, this can also be incredibly frustrating for people who want to play their favorite pet deck as close to pure as possible, only to discover that their list just gets trampled on by a majority of other decks in the game, even those that aren't even remotely rogue. So now that we have the full context, we can finally address the arguments surrounding Pot of Greed. For the remainder of this video, I'll be delving into the different pros and cons for moving Pot of Greed to the limited list. After everything is covered, I'll provide my final thoughts on this topic. Given that the goal of this video is to promote discussion, I highly recommend leaving any additional arguments for or against Pot of Greed that I failed to find or come up with in the comments below, so that I can respond to them there. I'm not really looking to milk this discussion over the course of multiple videos. I want this to be a one and done, and for the rest of the Yu-Gi-Oh community to pick up where I left off, so I can go back to working on other stuff. We'll start with the elephant in the room. Pot of Greed makes every deck more consistent. Anyone with an IQ higher than room temperature can figure out that unbanning Pot of Greed would turn the card into an immediate staple for a lot of decks in the game. I'm not going to say every deck, because that's not true. We'll get into that later. But the bottom line is that this becomes a problem when we account for the top tier decks in the format. Consider the following. Is it fair that a meta deck should be allowed to run Pot of Greed and be able to draw 2 cards for free if they open it in their hand or manage to get it into their hand turn 1? Let's use Kashtira as an example. For those unfamiliar with the current meta of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Kashtira is an Xyz deck that utilizes level 7 monsters to create a board state, which locks down the opponent's zones in the front and back rows. It has 2 main boss monsters that fuel their engine, Shangri-Ira and R-ACEist. What Shangri-Ira does is that each time a card is banished, it permanently locks a zone on the board while any copies of it are on the field. As for R-ACEist, it's basically a walking macrocosmos that acts like a power-crept Cyber Dragon Infinity. What it does is that it can attach 3 material once per turn to banish any single card on the field, and it's able to attach a banished card to itself from either banished zone once per chain if a card is banished during any given chain link. If you're familiar with any other card games, the closest analog to Kashtira is probably a deck like Link Joker from Cardfight Vanguard. In that game, Link Joker essentially spends its entire game trying to constrict the other player so that they can't really do much of anything while they slowly poke them to death. Kashtira is kind of like that, but since it's Yu-Gi-Oh!, it all happens in turn 1, basically. So it's more like a violent stranglehold. So again, I'll ask, would it be fair to give Kashtira a card that may let it potentially draw 2 for free during turn 1? Most of you at this point in the video are probably answering, no, it could produce way too much advantage, and the going second player wouldn't be able to do anything about it unless they open Ash. However, I think that without Pot of Greed, meta decks already produce way too much advantage to begin with. Even if Pot of Prosperity were banned in this format, Kashtira would still be the best deck in the room. The recent hit to a R-ACEist was a step in the right direction, but Fenrir's still at 3, Great Sylph is still at 3, R-ACEist is still at 3, and Unicorn being moved to 2 does basically nothing.
If the whole point of
banning Pot of Greed
is to stop these from showing up, then why not just cut out the middleman and
limit board.
ban them outright?
The bottom line is that absolutely nothing would change as far as how Konami would balance archetypes if Pot of Greed were legal. And unlike a card like Max C, which is unlimited in formats like the OCG and Master Duel, Pot of Greed at 1 copy wouldn't really come up anywhere near as frequently, nor would it be anywhere near as strong as a card like Max C. And this leads to my second argument. Ash Blossom.
This is a list of all the meta cards that I could come up with that this card can negate.
Jesus Christ!
so like ashing Rosin is going to be one of the best things that you can do. You could Imperm Rosin, but like the odds that they open Caesar or Borgo are pretty high.
Many would argue that unbanning Pot of Greed would make Ash Blossom a mandatory staple. In my opinion, I don't think it would make Ash Blossom any more of a staple than it already is, and this section of the video should help to clear up a lot of misconceptions about Ash Blossom versus generic draw cards. Before I continue, I need to make something very clear because I know that Yu-Gi tubers like Hardleg have already harped on Ash Blossom when it comes to discussing cards like Max C. My argument isn't that because Ash Blossom exists, it would magically make Pot of Greed more fair. That's just factually incorrect. My argument regarding Ash Blossom is that in most cases, you shouldn't be wasting an Ash on a generic draw card to begin with turn 1, and this includes other cards like Pot of Prosperity. Allow me to explain. When you activate Ash Blossom, you're committing to your one and only activation of a copy of that card for the rest of that turn. Therefore, you want to make sure that when you fire off your Ash Blossom, you're getting the most value out of it. And ideally, that means hitting a choke point in your opponent's combo in an attempt to end their turn sooner. Now, what would be considered a choke point that Ash Blossom would want to negate? An easy example of this would be a card like Branded Fusion, but perhaps we need a more complicated example to show just how much there is to consider when identifying a deck's choke point. We'll use my recent Novellas deck for example, since my viewers know me for brewing Hungry Burger decks. Man, I love that Ant is finally experimenting with new content on his channel. Ha! I tricked you! Novellas is a ritual deck that takes very few special summons to set up its turn 1 board. And it's an archetype that has not 1, but 2 Searcher spells that the deck plays at 3 copies each. Furthermore, the deck runs a lot of other generic ritual searchers and enablers, as well as it runs Terraforming, since one of its in-archetype searchers is a field spell. Now, similar to decks like Libromancer or Makonko, Novellas isn't a deck that's really going to be played pure in a more competitive setting. It's a very gimmicky archetype with a relatively small engine, discounting generic ritual support. And even if it could run a copy of Pot of Greed and Upstart, it wouldn't really get a lot of mileage unless you were to duct tape it to another archetype. Its whole gimmick is that the ritual monsters tribute opponents' monsters, as well as sometimes themselves, in order to special summon ritual monsters straight from the deck, which is a really strong gimmick. Beyond that though, it doesn't do a lot on its own aside from drawing cards once or twice with its engine, and setting up a single counter trap akin to Salaman Great Roar. Most people trying to innovate the deck currently have been running it with either Makonkos or Dogmaticas, and I've been experimenting with the latter since the Nadir Servant is a 1-card combo that turbos out Maximus and dumps Garura for another free draw one. And assuming you're able to get Maximus on board, you can then dump any 2 monsters from the extra deck into the graveyard. So in this example, what would be considered a choke point that I would hit with Ash Blossom specifically? The way I see it, the weak links in my deck are Nadir Servant or my ritual monsters, and that's what I would hit with Ash Blossom if I were facing my own deck. In the case of the Novellas ritual monsters, they can only activate their tribute effect once per turn. If their tribute effect gets negated, their entire game plan goes down the crapper and they become a sitting duck for a whole turn since each ritual leads into the next. As for Nadir Servant, there's a few reasons. Nadir is non-searchable. The combo it enables generates a crap ton of advantage if it isn't interrupted. And because there's no backup plan for the combo, hitting Nadir with Ash Blossom denies the Novellas player those resources for the entire turn. The point is that it's not always wrong to hit the other searcher spells in the deck, but it's inherently risky if you do so. If you were to just ash one of the many ritual searchers, the Novellas player could have a completely different searcher in their hand, or they could just go into their Nadir combo without having to worry again about Ash Blossom for the rest of the turn. Now obviously, if you were to open another completely different hand trap alongside Ash Blossom, you would have a lot more flexibility as to how you can stop your opponent's turn 1 plays. Or if you open a board breaker going second, ashing their deck at the right point increases the chances that their end board turn 1 won't be strong enough to stop your board breaker. Something else you have to consider is that these insane 1-card combos often still have hard once per turn stipulations for the cards that enable them. If your opponent happens to open with more than 1 copy of the same search spell in their hand after you negate its activation with Ash Blossom, it's not like they can just fire off the other copy. It's a break in their hand for the rest of their turn. So with all that said, I have to ask, Is Pot of Greed a choke point? The way I see it, it's only a choke point if the rest of their hand is a brick, which you can't really know unless they tell you or give it away in some form. As a result, I see ashing their copy of Pot of Greed as an inherently risky play, regardless of what 2 cards they pull off the top of their deck. This is a view I hold towards all the pot cards as well, aside from Pot of Avarice. For example, I rarely ash my opponent's Pot of Prosperity if they're going first, because A, it gives me knowledge of what cards are in their deck, B, it's not really a choke point in most cases, and C, the card they add to their hand may be a choke point instead, since if they grab a Searcher off a Pot of Prosperity, it tells me that they didn't have one in their hand to begin with. Now if the opponent is going second, it may be more justifiable to ash your opponent's Pot of Prosperity since they could draw into a board breaker, but that's a whole other argument. Although that sometimes may not always guarantee you a win, because if your opponent is siding for going second, they're most likely going to have some board breaker in their hand to begin with. And while we're on the topic of Prosperity, this leads into my third argument, which is that Pot of Prosperity at 3 copies is significantly better than Pot of Greed at 1. So to clarify, this section of the video isn't explicitly about Pot of Prosperity. The original draft did focus solely on comparing the 2 cards, but during the making of this video, I realized that I needed to revise this portion of the script because of the very real possibility that Prosperity could end up finding itself on the limited list in the future. However, even if Prosperity were to get hit, whether by the time this video releases or in the near future, there are other consistency cards in the modern day meta besides Prosperity that can still hold a candle to Pot of Greed at 1 copy. So we'll be looking at them here as well.
Yugi, here! Take this!
Huh? Grandpa?
I built this deck. I put my soul in these cards. And I taught you everything I know, Yugi. Take them. Take my cards and teach him respect. Teach Kaiba respect for the heart of the cards, Yugi.
Before we can properly address this topic, we need to first understand the definitions of and the difference between card advantage and card quality. The reason why we have to learn these concepts is because one of the biggest arguments against Pot of Greed is that it is a free +1 on resolution, so it's important that anyone participating in this discussion has at least a basic understanding of these 2 concepts. Doing so would help put into perspective why a free +1 isn't really that big of a deal in the modern game. According to an article on the Wizard's website, card advantage is defined as any process by which a player obtains effectively more cards than his opponent. By comparison, card quality is essentially how good a card in your deck is. The cards you run in your deck have to justify their existence, and they have to help you further your strategy more optimally if you're building a competitive deck. The kicker is that a card's quality is often situational. If you'll recall, I mentioned earlier in the video that Hell Shadal Hollow was a card that would be suboptimal in a deck like Runic, but would be great in something like Tearlament. That's the card's quality in action. It relates to its ability to aid in a given deck's game plan. Therefore, a card's quality is often subjective. The only properties that can be measured objectively when it comes to card quality is what the card does, what it costs to play the card or its effect, and how many decks in the game would want to run it. That final property can vary depending on the current meta when we're looking at these cards from a competitive standpoint. Some generic cards can be reasonably splashed in about any deck, whereas others have more specific use cases and can only see play if it aids in a certain deck's strategy. These are called staples and semi-staples respectively. You can also have cards that are specifically ran in decks to help aid in poor matchups or counter top-tier decks in the format, which we call tech cards. Board breakers and hand traps by their very definition are tech cards, even if some of them are good enough to be considered staples. But floodgates can vary between being a tech card or not. This is because of the nature of how floodgates work. They're often found in either stall-based strategies or in decks that can play under their conditions without any restrictions. But sometimes they may be included in the side deck if it counters a top-tier deck in the meta, which is why they can sometimes be considered tech cards. An example would be Dimensional Barrier, which has a floodgate effect that only lasts for a single turn. Anyone who's been pausing to read all my notes throughout this video already knows how I feel about this card along with most other single-turn floodgates. But it's not really the focus of this video, and there's an argument to be made that they're necessary for the health of the game, so we'll just leave it at that. So what makes a card better than some other card in its same category? Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Desires, for example, both do the exact same thing for completely different costs. So which would you rather run in a deck? If you've been paying attention, you can probably guess where I'm going with this. Both cards achieve relatively the same thing for a similar cost, so it depends on your deck's strategy. However, I would say that objectively, Pot of Desires is more widely used than Pot of Extravagance, because Desires doesn't prohibit you from drawing with other card effects for the rest of the turn, whereas Extravagance does. So in terms of card quality, Desires is better by a small amount, but there are situations where you'd rather play Extravagance. A deck like Labyrinth, for example, would rather run Extravagance than Desires if it had to choose between the two, because Labyrinth is a normal trap toolbox archetype. It doesn't want to banish a lot of the resources in its main deck. This begs the question then, what exactly is Pot of Greed's card quality in the modern game? I was very careful in the beginning of this video to ensure I was providing an accurate representation of the game during both 2005 and 2023, and the reason for that has to do with this specific argument. I explained that a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2005 often lasts many turns, and that you were very likely to see numerous power cards that could help swing the game in your favor and regain whatever advantage you had lost. I also showed that Pot of Greed had a lot of synergy with other cards that were commonly played at the time, which allowed the player resolving Pot of Greed to either optimize their draw to, or to retrieve it later from the graveyard. So let's break each of these points down and compare them to modern deck building philosophy. Games of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2023 last nowhere near as long as they did in 2005, and card advantage matters less than simply keeping your opponent from playing the game. It's pretty rare that a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Makes it past turn 3, and the reason for this is because someone usually concedes unless both players are piloting decks with a close matchup spread. In those situations, yes, card advantage would start to matter a lot more, but otherwise, board control is king, and the turn 1 player will throw everything at the turn 2 player in order to keep them from breaking their board. What this means is that you have far less opportunities to ever see Pot of Greed in your hand during a game if it's at 1 copy, and the +1 advantage in the modern game is nowhere near as game determining. So basically, it's hard to quantify the impact of splashing a copy of Pot of Greed into a deck in the modern game because, surprise surprise, it depends on the deck. On the one hand, you have archetypes like Salamangreat, Runic, or Sky Strikers, where Pot of Greed would be an auto-include for any deck list. But on the other hand, you also have archetypes like Branded or Tearlament, where the inclusion of Pot of Greed would actually require some justification, since it may potentially mess with Garnets in the deck, or overall hurt the consistency of their end boards compared to the staples that they currently use. It's because of this why these sorts of decks choose to run Prosperity instead of cards like Desires. And while we're on that topic, let's take a look at Prosperity along with other cards like Small World and Thrust. Because in all honesty, these cards have far greater utility in the modern game compared to a card like Pot of Greed. Not to mention that you wouldn't even want to run Pot of Greed in a deck that runs Prosperity, since they completely clash with each other. If Pot of Greed is comparable in impact to a card like Black Lotus, which I think is a bit of a stretch in the modern game, then Prosperity is akin to a card like Dig Through Time, except it can be activated turn 1. What Prosperity does is that you banish either 3 or 6 cards of your choice from your extra deck, and then you can either excavate 3 or 6 cards from the top of your deck and choose one of those cards to add to your hand, before placing the rest on the bottom of the deck in any order. While its cost appears to be incredibly strict in theory, in practice it's anything but. Any player that decides to run Prosperity in their deck isn't really going to want to run much other draw cards, and this is because of the plethora of searchers that exist in the game. In the modern game, search spells like Small World or Triple Tactics Thrust, along with in-archetype searchers, have more or less taken the place of many generic draw cards due to their card quality. Because a game of Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually lasts only a few turns, a generic draw card is inherently more risky to run in a deck than a search spell that has numerous guaranteed targets. The only exceptions to this are if the generic draw card doesn't conflict with your strategy, or if the additional draws are part of your deck's engine. And as you can see, the 3 examples I gave earlier fit that bill. Simply put, Pot of Prosperity just outright beats Pot of Greed at 1 copy in terms of utility, even if Pot of Greed doesn't have any cost. Now what about Small World and Thrust? While these cards don't always conflict with Pot of Greed and can be ran together, it's probably fair to argue that their impact is a lot greater than Pot of Greed, and that they arguably power creep the card in some aspects, despite each of them having hard once per turn stipulations. Small World, for example, is basically Witch or Sangan on crack. Not only is it on a spell card, but the possibility of what you can search for in the deck is a lot more personalized. When you activate a copy of Small World, what it does is that it takes a monster in your hand, allows you to target another monster in your deck with some similar aspect, and then you use that monster to target a third one, with some traits similar to the second monster. The cost of Small World, however, is that you have to banish the first two monsters before adding the third one to your hand. But what this ensures is that when you activate Small World, you're always getting a guaranteed target that you want. There is an argument to be made, however, that if a deck is running a Garnet to bridge between the first and third target, running a card like Pot of Greed may result in you drawing that Garnet and would essentially turn Small World into a dead card. So there is some thought that has to be taken first before you decide to throw Small World in with other draw cards. Though it's not a problem for every deck. Vanquished Soul, for example, could probably justify running both Pot of Greed and Small World, since the deck doesn't run Garnet and uses Small World as if it were a card like Rhoda. Thrust is also broken for similar reasons, and it's an even bigger staple in the meta than Small World. What it does is that if a monster effect was activated by your opponent during your turn, you can search your deck for any normal spell or trap and either set it onto the field or add it to your hand if your opponent has a monster on their field. Once again, the card quality of Thrust is absolutely insane. This card not only power creeps Pot of Greed, it power creeps Pot of Prosperity. Out of all the cards in this section of the video, this is the one that I see getting limited or banned in the future, which sucks because I actually like this card a lot. Not only does it further introduce additional counterplay into the game, but it also increases the opportunity for the turn 2 player to draw outside into the deck during games 2 and 3. It's such a necessary card in the modern meta of the game, given how Yu-Gi-Oh! Has evolved up until this point. So suddenly, a free +1 doesn't sound anywhere near as impressive now, does it? It's true that the card would see play in many decks, and it would marginally boost the power of those decks, but it seems ludicrous to suggest that Pot of Greed would warp the meta, especially since not every deck can justify running it since Prosperity is still legal at 3 copies. Though I suppose it's time we stop playing around and get to the root of this discussion. Pot of Prosperity, Small World, Thrust, all these cards are incredibly busted for sure, but they allow for skill expression and Pot of Greed does not. At the end of the day, there's nothing skillful about activating a card that lets you draw 2 for free, which is a statement I agree with. But do I think that's why it's remained on the ban list for as long as it has? Not in the slightest. Before we get into why Pot of Greed being an unskillful card has nothing to do with why it's banned, we first need to address some misconceptions about the Forbidden and Limited list. Yu-Gi-Tubers like Monkey Fight TCG have covered this ad nauseum, so I'll try to keep the explanation brief. The purpose of the Forbidden and Limited list is twofold. First, Konami uses it to be able to push new product, but secondly, the list is also used to clean up cards that make decks too powerful. Let's take the last few hits to tier limits as an example.
I don't understand. I have no idea. Like, what is it about tier limits that they just keep playing that deck? This deck looks like a freaking GOAT Control era deck. Get new cards, play new decks, please. This deck doesn't even look that good. Just do it, please. Please play a different deck. Because a ban list can't stop them anymore. That's been established. The ban list cannot stop them from playing tier limits.
For those unaware, Tier Limits is an archetype that was propelled into Tier 0 status last year after the release of the side set Magnificent Mavens. This product introduced the Ishizu monsters, retrained cards based on the monsters played by Ishizu Ishtar from the Duel Monsters anime, and when combined with the Tier Limit archetype, it produced what is to this day the strongest deck in the history of the TCG. Yes, even stronger than Zodiac. So to address the Tier 0 format, Konami banned the main extender of the deck and limited it a whopping 7 cards. And even after all that, the deck is still highly playable despite not being meta relevant anymore. That's just how strong Tier Limits is. However, Tier Limits was also an incredibly skillful deck. Despite being super oppressive, the deck had a lot of room for flexibility and player expression. While the most infamous Tier Limits build is the Ishizu tier variant, the archetype also has compatibility with Shaddolls, Branded, Punk, Sprite, Kashtira, and even Dangers, just to name a few off the top of my head. So that begs the question, did we nuke Tier Limits and the Ishizu cards into the ground because it was unskillful, or because it was too powerful? Perhaps we need a more simple example in order to really drive home the point. A Pointer of the Red Lotus is a card that also saw itself move to 1 copy before later getting banned. The reason it was banned was because it let the turn 1 player look at the opponent's hand and rip a card of their choice for 3 turns. And since I already established that games of Yu-Gi-Oh! End around turn 2 or 3, that basically made a pointer equivalent in impact to a card like the Forceful Sentry, which is an incredibly busted card that puts the opponent at an objective disadvantage for no cost whatsoever. Unlike a card like Change of Heart or Pot of Greed, cards like Delinquent Duo and the Forceful Sentry would without a doubt still be incredibly busted today. Hand control in the context of Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just stupidly oppressive, and it's why people still main deck Talents. A card like Thrust is most useful for going second, but Talents can be used going first after getting punished by an opponent's hand trap in order to potentially kill any one-card combos in their hand. So the argument that we can't unban Pot of Greed because it's too unskillful is a complete load of crap. Simply put, Pot of Greed at 1 copy just isn't powerful enough in 2023 to justify keeping it banned. The likelihood you'll even open the card is slim, and it's arguable whether or not resolving Pot of Greed is anywhere near as game determining as it was in 2005. And besides, both Prosperity and Thrust are just better cards all around, since searching cards is just objectively better if your deck has the option to run either of these 3 cards. But if all these reasons still aren't enough to convince you that we can unban Pot of Greed, and you think that the card needs to stay banned in order to serve as a benchmark for what is considered a bannable card, then perhaps this is indicative of a much larger issue, the design of the game itself. So let's talk about that. We're overdue for a new Master Rule anyways, and it's worth diagnosing the problems of the modern game to see if we can produce any sort of viable solutions. Strap yourselves in, this is a long one. The biggest issue that needs to be addressed in Master Rule 6 is that games need to last more turns on average than they currently do in Master Rule 5. I don't think Yu-Gi-Oh! Needs to go back to Edison levels of pacing, since that would just make Edison less unique. But it sucks that a player feels like they have to scoop as early as turn 2 or even sometimes turn 1. A game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Reaching at least turn 4 on average seems like a reasonable request. That's not to say we still can't have decks whose goals are to end the game sooner, but the bottom line is that going first currently provides way too much advantage over going second. At the moment, the only cards we have right now which seem to greatly aid in going second is Thrust and another card which the community has labeled Zeus No. 2. I think it's imperative that Konami continues to print future cards and archetypes like this if they want the game to have more back and forth. But how would we change the game in Master Rule 6 to further allow games to last more turns? My first suggestion would be that the turn 2 player should initially start with 6 cards in their hand, while the turn 1 player still starts with the initial 5. It can't be understated just how much of an advantage going first provides in Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So giving the going second player a handicap to compensate would go a long way to even out this difference. This is especially important if you're running a trap-heavy deck, since they're often at an even bigger disadvantage when they're going second. This means that the turn 2 player has a much greater chance to see any outs that they need to bust through the opponent's turn 1 board. My second suggestion is that while we should still allow for the turn 2 player to be able to attack on turn 2, dealing combat damage should be prohibited until turn 3. This provides a bit of relief in the early game for both players, since no one has to be worried about getting murdered for simply opening with a bad hand. This is a practice that a lot of games have actually, whether that's Magic the Gathering and how they limit what the player can do early game with its mana system, or if it's Cardfight Vanguard with its ride mechanic, which forces both players to wait until about turn 5 before they can start beating the hell out of each other with their grade 3 and 4 monsters. The grace period is a standard thing in other card games that just doesn't exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! It did in the older days of the game, but that was because power creep hadn't gotten out of control by then. So for the sake of fairness, it really should be reintroduced into the game in some form. Whether or not the solution I came up with is the best one is up for debate. Finally, my third suggestion would be that we increase the amount of cards drawn in the draw phase to 2. This would mean that on turn 2, the going second player starts with 8 cards in their hand, which increases the chances that the turn 2 player will see some sort of out to whatever unfair horse piss the turn 1 player has placed on their board. However, since the chances of the turn 2 player breaking through the turn 1 board will greatly increase, that means that the turn 1 player needs more resources in order to break through whatever defenses the turn 2 player managed to set up at the end of their turn. Why do I write such long sentences? And if they still don't manage to break through the turn 1 board, then you can consider the draw 2 as a reward for setting up such an impeccable defense with only a starting hand of 5 cards. Granted, I think the odds of that would be greatly reduced, but still. I think if Konami implemented all 3 of these changes, then no matter how bad power creep got in this game, the turn 1 and turn 2 player would still be on even ground. But then again, I haven't really had the opportunity yet to test any of these changes. It'll probably be something that I'll have to experiment with in my own homebrew format. But for anyone wanting to test this hypothetical Master Rules 6, I've left details for it in the description of this video. Beyond that though, I believe I've finally said my piece. I've covered pretty much every angle that I was able to consider by myself, so I'll say my final words and leave it to the rest of the Yu-Gi-Oh community to continue the discussion from here. In conclusion, I don't think there's any harm in taking Pot of Greed off the Forbidden list even for just a single format to see what it does to the game. We tried it with Change of Heart and it had next to no impact beyond giving going second decks an additional confiscation spell. I explained why the arguments for keeping this card banned is total bunk, and I provided examples of other cards which are fully legal that basically serve the same purpose as Pot of Greed, while showing why they're still healthy for the game. And for those who vehemently disagree with moving Pot of Greed back to 1, despite all the reasons I gave in this video, I also played devil's advocate and shared ideas for Master Rules 6. The changes I suggested would help even out the power balance between the first and second player, and it would make Pot of Greed a truly broken card again. So with all that said, I'd like to thank you for watching my video. I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone's thoughts on this topic once it releases. I've been working non-stop on this video since June, and it had to undergo multiple revisions to account for recent shifts in the meta, as well as updates to the card pull and ban list and discussions in the community. I know especially that Prosperity, for example, is one of those cards that people either love or hate, and I hope I was able to contribute to that discussion with this video. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to do the thing and check out the other content on my channel. You can also check out the links in the description if you want to support the channel. Anyways, I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for 400 subs, and I can't wait to see where I go from here. I summon Pot of Greed to draw 3 additional cards from my deck. That's not what it does. Roll my dice. That is what it does. Pot of Greed. Draw 3. I summon Pot of Greed to draw 3 additional cards from my deck. And I summon Pot of Greed to draw 3 additional cards from my deck. Then I play Magic Force, which allows me to play Pot of Greed once again to draw 3 additional cards from my deck. You know he's right, Yug. And then I attack and I win, right? No. Well, you don't have any monsters and oh, he's supposed to be here. Oh no, he got the Celtic Guardian, Yug. My turn. I summon Dark Magician. I also summon Jack's Knight. What? How? You can't summon a bunch of cards on one turn. That's against the rules. You never saw this coming. I summon Pot of Greed to draw 3 additional cards from my deck. That's not what it does. It doesn't do that. That's what it does. That's what it does, Yugi.